Awesome. Okay, we have so much great content to go through today. So I am going to take the liberty of getting started and we will just ease into everything. But with that, I'll go ahead and just introduce myself to everyone. My name is Christina Lampert. I am the Director of Growth and Innovation here at HowGood. I've had the pleasure of meeting so many already on this call, and if I haven't met you yet, I would love to connect afterwards. But it's great to be here with you. I work primarily with so many of HowGood's current customers, prospective customers, and I really wanted to put this session together because I have been seeing in the market this emphasis on conducting a greenhouse gas inventory baseline. And so this has been really interesting for me because I think, yeah, this is the emphasis, but the reality of what we really need to be focusing on is what happens after the baseline and the reduction strategy. And so that's really the meat of what we'll be talking about today, right? How do we go beyond the baseline and unlock things after the fact? So with that, I am going to take us through a couple of things today. The first is I'm just going to give a very quick synopsis of the state of the greenhouse gas baseline, what I've been seeing in terms of accuracy. And then we'll also be going into, based on the quality of data that you're working with for the baseline, how does that actually translate to what you're able to do in terms of reduction after the fact? So we're going to be walking through actually a couple of scenarios today, one using databases that are not HowGood, that are kind of comprised of LCI databases. And then we're also going to be going through one using HowGood's data and emission factors, just so you can kind of see the difference, both with regard to the baseline, but again, what happens after the baseline. So with that, I will go ahead and get us started just on the first piece there. I think I am going to go ahead and just put on my headphones just to make sure everyone can hear me okay. And we'll go ahead and get started. So with that, just in terms of the state of the baseline today, right, we're going to be honing in on the scope 3 side of it specifically. And this also assumes kind of more of that activity-based methodology. But what we've been seeing is that the majority of the inventory is calculated using what we call generalized emission factors from an LCI database. So this could be an eco-invent, this could be an agribullies, you name it, just kind of more of those, generalized data points there. And what we're seeing, at least in the CPG retailer ingredient supplier side of things, is that the majority of emission factors that are being used to conduct the inventory are coming from here. Now, we also know that there is so much wonderful progress happening where suppliers are also providing emission factors. However, today we see that that still makes up a relatively small portion of inventory there. And so we're going to be diving into some of the risks and opportunities that we've seen in both of these categories. Now, if we focus on the generalized emission factors coming from LCI databases, there are a couple of different risks that we've seen, just basically doing some analyses here. And the way that we've mapped these is on a spectrum from left to right, where I tried to kind of put this on a map to understand, like, okay, how material are these risks to the accuracy of our baseline, and also beyond the baseline, helping us unlock reduction insights and strategies from there. And so there's many different risks. However, we're going to be focusing on 3 today. The first is ingredient concentration. So what do we mean by this? Well, what we've been seeing is that emission factors from generalized databases often don't reflect this emphasis of ingredient concentration. And so the easiest example that I like to tell in terms of like, what is ingredient concentration and why does it matter? I usually use apple juice concentrate as an example. And so oftentimes, if you are a food company and you are trying to account for an ingredient, a purchased good like apple juice concentrate, maybe you're formulating with it, maybe the closest thing that you're able to match to is an apple. But we know that on average, it actually takes 4.5 kilograms of apples to produce 1 kilogram of apple juice concentrate, not to mention the processing methodology that also has to be considered. And so this is what HowGood has essentially done the work to make sure that ingredient concentration is applied to every single one of our ingredients, chemicals, and materials studied. And so what we're seeing in the market is if the food company is trying to account in their baseline for raw materials like beef gelatin, beef stock, or uncooked beef, just to name a couple of unique instances, oftentimes just using kind of like big data methods, maybe they're just seeing beef in the name and all they're able to match to is beef, perhaps coming from South America. But with HowGood, having reflected ingredient concentration, we actually study the exact amount that should be attributed to that specific material based on ingredient concentration. So when this is reflected, you're now going to see pretty stark differences and much more accuracy as it comes to the specific material. So we see beef gelatin now having a much lower emission factor compared to uncooked beef coming from France with this now reflected. Okay. And so this alludes to the next thing that we're seeing, right? Another thing that we often don't see reflected within baselines is geographic specificity. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of examples there. If we take that same ingredient, same instance, so let's say we are looking to map a specific raw material like wheat, maybe all we're able to find is a generalized emission factor for the EU. But with HowGood's methodology, we take a much more granular approach where we are actually looking at peer-reviewed literature, life cycle assessments, and high-quality studies that have been done studying crops as it pertains to much more granular regions. So here, for example, you're going to see many different emission factors for different regions, even within Europe. And we're able to substantiate all of this, again, with peer-reviewed literature behind the scenes. So we're essentially doing that granular research on behalf of your team. And so when we bundle this up, these numbers right off of the bat may not look like they differ that much, but if we actually take into consideration the amount of metric tons of wheat that, I don't know, a major food company may be sourcing, it actually adds up to significant variance. So just in this example alone, if you're sourcing 600,000 metric tons of wheat, this means that there could be a variance of up to 216,000 metric tons of CO2e just within this instance alone. Okay. Now, to close this part out, the other risk that we typically see with leveraging more of those like generalized emission factors is that sometimes it is not clear to the team doing the accounting where the life cycle boundaries are. Where do they start? Where do they cut off? And we're going to give you an example of that. So, for example, if we go back to our beef raw material examples or beef derived examples here, we know that we need to do some accounting, right? Maybe we're working on SBTI flag where we need to pay attention to statistical land use change and on-farm land management stages, but also maybe we're accounting for purchased goods and services where we need to understand what's in processing, transportation between tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. So it can get really complicated really quickly. And so what HowGood does is we actually make that so clear. So you're able to say, okay, now compounding off of ingredient concentration, let me now take this even further and start to break out very easily what are the emissions that I should be accounting for statistical land use change, right? We can see that here. What are the emissions then for the next stage on farm or land management emissions there? So we break that out and then we even go on into additional metrics like land occupation, also very relevant for flag, as well as things like biodiversity impact, soil health, and you name it. So we just wanted to give you just a little bit of an insight for some of those risks that we're seeing just in terms of that realm. And these are only 3. We actually have started mapping upwards of like 10 general areas that we're seeing that can be introducing risk into the business. And they can all be found in our white paper here at the business case for granular emission factors, where we even take it a step further and we say, here are the business implications for using generalized emission factors. So feel free to check out that there. So the other, I think, subject quickly to touch on from what we've been hearing from our customers is even with supplier provided emission factors, they are awesome and they're so incredible to have. But as our own customers are still working to account for their baselines for SBTI flag, sometimes even leveraging supplier specific emission factors doesn't necessarily break out those boundaries that they need for certain reporting. And sometimes there may not also be the transparency that they need from a data source perspective too. So this is just a quick example of that. Like maybe you do have a supplier provided emission factor for soy protein isolate, but in order for your flag accounting, in order for purchase goods and services, or maybe you're also doing a cradle to grave life cycle assessment, it's also really helpful to augment and make sure that you have those broken out. So maybe we have this, but we need to get to a point where we have the emission factor for the land use change stage, land management, transportation to processing as well, and the other life cycle stages. And so if these are ever a question mark, like how do we get from this to break down into each of these, that's where HowGood can augment really nicely and fill in the gaps while still using everything that your supplier provided as well. So the other thing is data source transparency and also just augmenting if you need any further substantiation there. So with that, the question becomes, okay, great. So how do I get more granular? Where can I kind of fill in the gaps? And then we'll move into what are the implications for the baseline and scenario planning for carbon reduction as well. So we are going to go into some example, GHG inventories, if you will. We're going to do a before and after, and the after is kind of leveraging HowGood's data and HowGood's emission factors. And I figured before we go into that, it might just be useful to spend a couple of minutes introducing HowGood in the event that you're not familiar with our methodology, how we calculate things. So I'm just going to spend a minute or two giving you that overview before we dive into some of those case studies. So if you haven't heard about HowGood before or haven't met with us, we have been around for 17 years mapping global food supply systems. So our roots are inherently in this hardcore agricultural research side of things, which is where we know the majority of environmental and social impact is derived from. And we have a human research team that's comprised of incredible life cycle assessment specialists, agricultural researchers, even food scientists who essentially analyze, review research coming out on over 600 different data sources. And you can think of one data source as like International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment, OpenLCA. So even within those, there's like thousands and thousands of awesome high quality studies that we are leveraging for our research out. And this has allowed us to amass this high quality database of over 90,000 on-farm emission factors. So getting really specific where it matters most. And to date, based on our work with global retailers, global food companies, we've assessed over 1 million global food products as well. So we have really high criteria and really powerful benchmarking capabilities. We're also going to be touching on supplier specific information today as part of our work and our case studies. And I think it's also worth mentioning that we have a supplier directory already where suppliers have signed up for it, provided their primary data, and those are able to be leveraged by all of our software platform users as well, with zero effort required for either party to use those. So we're going to get into this more deeply, but the question is like, okay, what does this actually look like in terms of action and differences in the quality of impact data? So let's just say we are working with a specific type of sweetener, but maybe all we're able to find with a general database is a sweetener, and we have an emission factor for that, and maybe it's a global average. With HowGood, you're going to see in some of the case studies here in a minute, you are able to go so much more specific in terms of your accounting and also unlock reduction strategies because of it. So then HowGood is able to say, okay, here's a specific emission factor for brown rice syrup that takes into consideration ingredient concentration. We can see how that differs from corn syrup. We can see how that differs from maple syrup. We can see some of those variances that we need to pay attention to. We can even go further than this based on the high quality data and research that we're able to leverage and say, okay, for brown rice syrup, we actually know that it's going to have a totally different emission factor specific to the United States based on growing practices there, as it compares to China and as it compares to Thailand. But then we also know there are specific suppliers that have verified certain agricultural practices on the ground. And so we can start getting even more granular and saying, okay, here's a specific emission factor based on growing practices for natural foods in China. Same thing with anchor farms, and kind of see how those differ to inform our procurement decisions or our long-term strategy for supplier engagement. So that's just an overview of HowGood, and essentially this is what has allowed us to become the largest ingredient and product sustainability database in the world. And this is really what's backing some of the numbers that we're going to go into. I think it's also worth noting that all of the emission factors that we're about to go through that are leveraging HowGood's data are in compliance with the GHG protocol in terms of structure, can be used for CDP reporting. We are in the process of being verified and audited by Carbon Trust, also in alignment and contributing to global industry coalitions, and also just checking the box for many important regulatory compliance figures as well. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a good foundation before we go into some of the numbers. Okay, so coming back to this, we are going to now go through a case study where we have an example GHG inventory leveraging emission factors from more of those generalized data sets. And then we're going to do a side-by-side comparison to how accurate we could actually get with HowGood's data so that you're able to kind of tangibly see, like, what is the over-reporting potential, what's the under-reporting potential, and even use this as tools to evaluate your own baseline if you've already done one. And then we're going to go more into the reduction side of it. So I'll walk us through that now. So let's say we have our example baseline here. So maybe first things first, we have our list of raw materials that we are sourcing as a food company. Maybe we're sourcing 40,000 metric tons of rice starch, and maybe we have the transparency and we know that that rice is originally being grown in Arkansas in the US. Then maybe we have cornstarch. Maybe we know that the origin crop of corn is being grown in Iowa. And then we do that for basically everything we're sourcing at large. Okay, and we lay all of that out. Then we're going to use our, we can call this like control group, if you will. So maybe we're now looking at, okay, using our information, maybe here's all we're able to get to in terms of specificity with the generalized database emission factor. So maybe the closest thing we're able to match to for rice starch is actually a rice dried market mix coming from the USA generally. Maybe all we're able to find is a global emission factor for cornstarch. Same thing with like a global emission factor for strawberry, and we can see some of these instances as we go down. Another notable one that we've seen is actually palm oil with a country of origin with the Netherlands, which has been kind of interesting. And then you're going to see the emission factors that are kind of used from there. And so if we multiply these together, of course, we're able to deduce and calculate the metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that comes from each of these instances. So next, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you the same example, but with HowGood data. So we've identified some risks, right? It doesn't account for ingredient concentration. Maybe it doesn't account for geographic specificity. And so we're now going to shift into the scenario using HowGood that essentially will mitigate these risks that we're seeing on the right-hand side and essentially allow us to get to a much more accurate baseline. So with that, we're now going to see HowGood's data populated. And I think we'll send these slides through afterwards, but a couple of notable improvements just in terms of accuracy is we're now able to account for rice starch specific to that ingredient, reflecting ingredient concentration, but also reflecting an emission factor specific to rice being grown in Arkansas. Same thing with cornstarch. We're now able to allocate this specific to Iowa. Strawberry puree, we're now accounting for the procedure and the emissions that it takes to get a strawberry into an actual puree being grown specific to California, and things like that. I think another notable thing here is, let's say you know that your beef is coming from a specific supplier and you know that that supplier is sourcing from different regions. This is an example where we have uncooked beef now broken out for a certain percentage coming from Colorado, a certain percentage coming from Canada, a certain percentage coming from Oklahoma on behalf of a supplier. And so we're able to make sure that that's accurate as well now, since HowGood has emission factors for each of those locations. And so if we evaluate our baseline, basically what we're starting from, we can start to draw conclusions that working with generalized emissions has an implication in terms of the accuracy, in terms of over-reporting and under-reporting. So if we calculate these totals, we can see a huge difference in terms of the metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And if we total these up, we're actually able to now do this side by side, where using generalized emission factors in this case amounted to over 4,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Then we can compare that to leveraging HowGood, which is where we're now able to use that same list of raw materials, same list of how much we're sourcing. The specificity, we can now say this amounts to just under 2,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which essentially helps us understand that we may be over-reporting our emissions by 56%. So huge implications there. And what we're going to be going into next, which is the majority of our focus for today, is right, why we're all here in our jobs, is like, how does this actually implicate our ability to reduce? How does this translate to the level and the comprehensiveness of the insights that we're able to glean to actually make progress on our GHG reduction targets, get a faster time to our net zero and things like that? So that's what we're going to be moving into next. So with that, I am going to introduce us kind of into the philosophy of how you can think about, like, how would this implicate, that reduction strategy here. So I tried to map this again on what I call carbon reduction potential. So by using generalized emission factors, what could that essentially limit us maybe as we look to reduce? So the first thing is that, based on what we've seen, is that using generalized emission factors can give you limited or inhibit insights for alternative suppliers if you're not able to get down to that very granular supplier level emission factor. We've also seen that it could inhibit insights for standards and certification changes that you could make that may influence greenhouse gas emissions. So some that I'm thinking about are, land to market, looking at even biodiversity impacts for regenerative organic certified, you name it. It could also inhibit the access you have for modeling different alternative sourcing locations and how that could ultimately help you reduce. It could also kind of prohibit any insights for agricultural practice changes. And I think based on what we've seen is, if you don't have access to this database, for example, with HowGood of over 33,000 ingredients, chemicals, and materials, maybe you just don't have access to understand like raw material changes that you can make that actually could have a drastic amount of CO2e reduction should that move forward in business operations. And so based on what we've seen, if you're able to kind of work with these could be highly influential in terms of the reduction that you're actually able to achieve. And then more so on the left-hand side, maybe these could be somewhat influential. And again, this is just kind of using the sample size of our customer work at HowGood. So for the sake of our case study moving forward, that before and after in terms of reduction potential, we're going to focus on a couple of examples in these three areas. But if you ever wanted to talk about all 5 of these, we would be happy to set up some time. So just with this, we're now going to go back to our inventory, right, and our reduction strategy. And typically what we've seen is these types of emission factors can get you so far, but then it's like we need that next layer of insights to get us much closer and actually hit our reduction target. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today, showing you how HowGood can take you into that next level of your GHG reduction journey. So we're going to come back to our case inventory, right? We have rice starch, as we're familiar with, coming from Arkansas, cornstarch, you name it. And we're going to assume that we are referencing our inventory from what we were working with originally. So you're going to see that original inventory matches here. And so what we're going to be focusing on now is actually just picking a couple of these raw material sourcing location scenarios. And basically just like, I think we've picked 4 for today, and we're actually going to go through them one by one and show you what a reduction potential or reduction insight could look like, leveraging generalized emission factors compared to working with a partnership like HowGood, and what that could essentially unlock for you, and what that could look like from a quantification perspective too. So with that, I'm going to first just pick rice starch as an example. Sometimes when we're working with teams, there's obviously a couple of different levers that you can explore using HowGood data, but for the purposes of rice starch, I'm going to move forward with the research question of, okay, if I'm working with rice starch and we're formulating with rice starch, is there another type of starch that I could leverage or work on with my R&D and innovation team that has a lower impact? Okay, so I'm going to proceed with rice starch, and maybe with that research question, as I go out using generalized emission factors or like a generalized data set today, maybe all I'm actually able to find in terms of starch is a market maize starch, and I have an emission factor for that. And if I look at the emission factor, it turns out that it's actually higher than rice starch, so that doesn't really help me with much or allow me to glean a lot of insights in terms of production. And so what we found is that a lot of teams are transitioning to HowGood because they're able to literally just punch in starch into our ingredient planning tool as an example, and it's able to populate every single starch that we have in our database. And this is actually a relatively small amount of the list, but I just kind of picked a few for demonstrative purposes. And this now gives them so much insight, so much opportunity to work with R&D, to work with innovation on a couple of different scenarios. And they're able to see emission factors that every single option in this example is lower than the original factor that they were working with. So very quick insights there to start working from. And I think it's worth noting that even within one of these, there's even more insights that can be unlocked. So maybe we want to explore cornstarch as an example. We can even see all of the sourcing locations that we've had and that we've studied to start then working with procurement in the event that we proceed with cornstarch to say, all right, great, let's actually pick a sourcing location if we don't source cornstarch yet from a supplier that has the lowest emission factor from there. So a lot of different levers. We can even take this, we call this Russian doll, I'm thinking in LCA world, we can even take this a level further and go into specific suppliers within each region and agricultural practices, which is something we're working on too. But let's say for the sake of this analysis, we proceed with arrowroot starch. Maybe we're working on a new product innovation line and we change our supply there. So we'll come back to this in a second, but just wanted to walk you through, and we'll revisit this calculation at the end summary when we quantify everything based on metric tons sourced. Okay, so the next example that we're going to walk through is skim milk powder. Let's say we know it's coming from the US and maybe, we are currently working with some sort of global average. Well, the research question that we may have is like, okay, we can see that this is a skim milk powder. Are there any other types of milk powders that we could explore again with R&D, with innovation, that have a lower greenhouse gas impact, but also maybe meet our criteria for taste, functionality? Maybe we even have a B2B customer that we're producing for that's asking for a lower alternative, or maybe they're really pushing to lower their scope 3 emissions, and we're looking for ways in order to meet that customer demand. So we'll proceed now with this example for skim milk powder. So same thing here, we have the raw material, we have maybe the emission factor we're currently working with for that. And with HowGood, again, we can just punch in milk powder as an example, and we now have a more comprehensive list of milk powders in the food system. We can see the assumed location based on global import-export data. And then we can see, just for purposes of example, our on-farm emission factors, which is where we know the majority of impact comes from. And then we can also, of course, model in transportation as well using the HowGood platform. But for the purposes of this tells us a couple of things. Number one, if we are looking at rice milk powder, we can actually see right off of the bat that there are some trade-offs to consider. If we do proceed with rice milk powder, we probably want to work with procurement and source that from Arkansas rather than Cambodia, for example. But if we start working with R&D and innovation and whatever team that might look like, maybe they say, yeah, soy milk powder would be a great fit, a great alternative to explore. And so we're able to proceed with that scenario there. So again, just a quick flow. Now, the next example that we'll walk you through has more to do with looking at alternative sourcing locations. So maybe you're currently sourcing palm oil. Maybe you have some transparency, maybe you don't, but maybe the majority of your palm oil is coming from Indonesia. And so we're going to proceed with that. The research question that we're about to move through this flow with is, okay, if I have a more accurate understanding of impact for palm oil coming from Indonesia, what changes could I make over the next couple of years, or maybe my long-term sourcing strategy to actually reduce impact based on sourcing location alone? So if I go into palm oil, maybe I've found, a global emission factor that I'm able to use. Maybe I now punch in palm oil into HowGood's database, and I'm able to now see all of the different sourcing locations that HowGood has researched and has really high quality emission factor information on for palm oil coming from Malaysia, for palm oil coming from Ecuador, Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand, you name it. And I think it's also worth noting bringing in the land use change emission factor as well, because we know that this is very material, very relevant to pay attention to, in addition to the on-farm emission factor for the specific material, and also just for our flag strategy, if that's something we're working on. So now all of a sudden I have so much more to work with in terms of scenario modeling. And not to mention, if I even have further transparency here, I can go a level deeper and look at specific regions even within these regions in itself. So very granular from that perspective. Now, we've also worked with customers who have done incredible work in terms of getting transparency from their palm suppliers. And so I wanted to walk you through an example where if you're working with a more granular data set like HowGood's, you can also reflect that work into your emission factors, which I think gets really exciting to do. So let's say we have palm oil. Let's say we have two different suppliers. Let's say that supplier A has provided us with transparency information with regard to where growing regions are and where they're sourcing from with regard to smallholder farmers. So maybe supplier A, we know that 60% is coming from Mexico, maybe 23% coming from Costa Rica, and we can kind of see that sourcing breakdown here. And then let's say supplier B is all coming from Indonesia, just for demonstrative purposes. Because HowGood has emission factors for each of these sourcing locations, we can now deduce a supplier-specific emission factor from there. So now with supplier A, based on the sourcing mix and these emission factors pertaining to the locations, we have an emission factor for that supplier. And we also have one for the other supplier. And so as we're thinking about reduction potential, we can now glean the insights to determine, okay, if we shift all of our supply to supplier A over the longer term, pending the cost benefit analysis also matches up, a much more informed decision just from a reduction potential there. So kind of gleaning those, and we'll summarize this in our summary slide here in a second, just in terms of how this rolls up with the metric tons of palm that's being sourced. Okay, so that was the palm example. We have one more example just to walk you through, kind of on a similar note before we get into the summary stages here. So beef is, I would say, a big topic for a lot of our customers. And so we wanted to make sure we kind of walk through a couple of strategies just on this material alone. So Again, maybe you have your supplier name, you're sourcing the majority of your beef from them, you have the amount of metric tons that you're sourcing for that beef, and we're gonna walk through now the research question of, if I have a couple of different beef suppliers and I have transparency into where I'm sourcing that beef from, how could that essentially unlock our reduction insights in the longer term? So we're gonna now move into beef as an example. Maybe we have that general emission factor that we're working with, and then maybe with HowGood, we're now able to plug in all of the information that we know with regard to our beef suppliers. So again, for simple purposes, we have supplier A, we have supplier B, we have the database locations. Maybe we actually have the supplier already submitted and kind of signed up for HowGood supplier directory, and they've already submitted their information. So you're able to leverage that. And with this information alone, we're able to, again, marry these up and start to understand a very specific emission factor based on that sourcing mix for supplier A, US Beef Supply Co., and then we can compare that to Brazil Supply Inc. And again, just now have the information that we need to do more informative scenario planning and unlock more insights for actually reducing in the longer term and reporting that reduction at large. Okay. So that concludes kind of this portion. And when we bundle up all of these changes or all of these reduction insights, we're able to now have a scenario where, okay, here are reduction insights for continuing with our current state of using generalized emission factors. And then we can see what this translates to in terms of a difference for leveraging a HowGood partnership. So implementing these changes, we know that using generalized emission factors, maybe this is what we're working with, but actually going into HowGood's data set, using HowGood's platform, we're able to unlock much more granular insights that actually allow us to reduce over 1,000 metric tons of CO2e just within this very, I would say, like miniature sample data set alone, right? Sample set of raw materials. And so just within this case study and case example, we're able to demonstrate a 29% in GHG reduction. So obviously this is all for, example purposes, but these were all kind of using real instances that we've seen working with our customers today. And I think the next thing we wanted to walk you through is like, just to summarize, there are so many benefits of kind of transitioning to using more granular data, some of which we'll point out here and some of which are even kind of like more tangible, less tangible, but these are kind of what we've heard from our customers so far after the fact of their transition. So number one, by transitioning to more granular emission factors, I think we've kind of talked about that at large today during the webinar, but you can expect that your baseline will certainly be more accurate because of that specificity with regard to geographic sourcing location, because of that specificity with regard to making sure ingredient concentration is reflected, agricultural practices, standards and certifications, you name it. And then from there, because your baseline is that much more accurate and because you're actually working with a database where you can explore so many alternative scenarios, you're able to unlock far greater insights for actual CO2 ever could have working with kind of those standstill global average emission factors from there. Now what we've seen is this then allows our partners to meet their sustainability targets faster, which in my opinion is the most exciting part, and we're actually able to see change happen on the ground, which ultimately we've also seen improve businesses' bottom line. So we don't have enough time to go into this, but it's something I love to study, and you will see so many calculations in that white paper that we discovered. But we've seen by being able to meet targets faster to show quantified progress, this ultimately leads to lower cost of capital in a lot of instances. It can also lead to a decreased cost of carbon offsets. So if you are, working for a company that has announced a net zero target or carbon positive target, maybe in X amount of years, the company is expecting to have to purchase offsets in order to meet that. By decreasing ahead of time, that essentially lowers the cost required for carbon offset investment. So kind of a direct cost savings perspective from there. And then we've also seen, just even at the product level, if you shift from moving from moving global average emission factors to granular ones, you're now able to get a much more specific emission factor for your actual product that could qualify your product for something like HowGood Climate Friendly, which means it has a low carbon footprint that maybe a competitive product couldn't qualify for because they're still using generalized emission factors themselves. So it also kind of provides you with this really unique competitive advantage as well, just in terms of differentiation. And so another thing, and we just wanted to close with this before we go into the Q&A portion of today's session, but oftentimes whenever we do these exercises, whenever we do emission factor comparisons with our customers, it's like, okay, great. We have now analyzed the emission factors we're using today. We know that they're kind of generalized, and we know that there's opportunity for improvement. If we want to shift to using HowGood's data and shift to using HowGood's emission factors specifically for our corporate accounting, what does that look like? What do we have to do? What should we be considering, right? It's a lot of work to even do a baseline. Maybe you already did one. So that's a question we get. Yeah, we already submitted our baseline. How do we actually reflect this moving forward in the event that we proceed with the partnership? And I think another just general question is, yeah, if we want to shift data sets at large for everything we do, what does the GHG protocol actually say in terms of guidance? And so we don't have a lot of time to go in depth in terms of what that transition plan actually is, but we can certainly set up time to walk you through it. For the purposes of today, I can direct you to the GHG protocol corporate value chain scope 3 accounting and reporting standard. I feel like it's kind of like our Bible in our world, but specifically in here within chapter 9, it will give you specific guidance for a couple of different things. So they say in there, yeah, a company might report the same GHG emissions as in previous years, but measure or calculate them differently over time. For example, if they find that there's an opportunity for improving their data quality, definitely, by all means, GHG protocol certainly encourages this in terms of accuracy and better precision. And if the company decides to do that, they are required to recalculate a base year emissions that applies this new data source and methodology. So this is something that we're able to easily do within the HowGood Lattice platform. We're doing it for customers today, and we'd be happy to explore this strategy with you and kind of walk you through, hand in hand what this takes and ultimately what the process looks like. So with that, we can close out the session today. We'll send through some slides, just kind of summarizing all of the abatement strategies that you can reduce and some of the levers that you can work with. We also have a buyer's guide that we can direct you to. This is available on our website, which essentially gives you a checklist for things that you may want to consider when you're looking at sustainability software or a platform or even just general impact data at large. So feel free to check that out. And with that, I think that concludes our content segment of today. And we kind of wanted to leave 15 minutes for Q&A. We're excited to get into that with you. And yeah, I'll pause and just check the chat for any specific questions from here. But if you have to hop, no worries. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to connecting with you soon. Okay, so does HowGood have emission factors for organic agriculture, regenerative organic agriculture, and conventional agriculture by any chance? This is an awesome question, Lauren. I see that you have answered. So the answer is, yeah, if you wanted to set up a meeting and really understand and see some of those metrics as it relates to the different standards and certifications, we could certainly set that up. The reality is that a lot of the peer-reviewed literature today shows some discrepancies in terms of actual conclusions in terms of GHG emission factors for organic versus conventional. Some of those have to do with the fact that for certain crops, it turns out that if you look at the, farming system as a whole, the GHG impact for organic may be lower, but when we're actually looking at the specific product level, as it relates to the yield, sometimes GHG impact can be calculated as higher for organic. So we'll just walk you through methodology from there, but yes, we could actually definitely explore that. So that's that question. Cloud, nice to see you. I see your question being more granular for emission factor definitely helps us increase the accuracy of our footprint, but in order to capture supplier carbon reduction plans, this will also require additional effort from the supplier side. What's your experience in finding the balance between granularity level and ability to collect data from supplier at a similar granularity level as well? This is such a good question, and this is something we're actually launching what we call like a supplier engagement playbook. And so we'd have to probably do some diagnostic meetings just to understand where you are, but a typical path that we recommend to our customers is essentially starting with, okay, let's get your list of raw materials, how much you're sourcing, how much you know about sourcing location, let's integrate any supplier specific emission factors that you have today, and then let's do a GHG assessment to understand what are the highest scope 3 contributors, including all of that information, and maybe we take the top 10 to 15% of those sourcing scenarios and start to unpack, okay, this looks like a high risk situation. Maybe we start to work with the supplier to get that granular data there, or maybe we already have it and maybe we start to model agricultural practices from there with the supplier. So a couple of different options, but we love this topic and we'd be happy to go more in depth with you there. I will also say that we have a key practices questionnaire, and we also have a version of our platform that suppliers can use to submit their information. So we make it pretty seamless and kind of increase the time to get that data at large, all kind of working together in tandem. Okay, next question comes from Kathy. So how are you working with producers who have concerns with the SBTI flag and land use change guidance methodology? Are you doing work with these folks to augment the methodology to more accurately reflect their footprints, help them figure out a path to measuring, disclosure, and etching? Yes, so this has been a really exciting, how do I say this, behavior that we're seeing in the market where, way back when our work started with retailers, we were assessing, food products, and then the food manufacturers started saying, great, you're assessing this, how can we essentially improve? Then we started working with food manufacturers. Now that we're working with food manufacturers who are doing a similar exercise, we're now seeing so many ingredient suppliers now come to us and say, great, we want to improve, we want to account as well, and we want to make sure that we line up with the methodology that our customers see. And so this is why we've actually started working with, over the last couple of years, so many ingredient suppliers who are also using our platform to make sure that everything lines up, and then using our scores, our emission factors on behalf of the research that we're doing with them to communicate downstream to their customers who are also using our platform. So again, happy to explore that more in depth, but hopefully that just gives you a high level perspective on that. Another question from Kathy. In developing the average, is it based on the average of submitted data? Does it consider outliers? Does it apply a heavier weight to a known growing sourcing location? So Kathy, we can connect offline with this. I'm not sure if the question is in relation to the global average that's being used, perhaps prior to a HowGood relationship. Oftentimes what I've seen working with customers is just that, like, we actually don't know. And that's the challenge of working with global emission factors. Sometimes it's not transparent. If a proxy was used, it's not transparent. If a growing sourcing was actually used to calculate that average. And so it's a little bit tough to say. Okay, question from Amanda. Hi, Amanda. When the data identifies palm oil with an emission factor sourced from Papua New Guinea or Indonesia as being one of the lower options to achieve a brand GHG reductions, is there then an indicator to help illustrate risk geopolitical of sourcing from working with a supplier from X country and a potential disruption for that supply? I think this is a great question. I can say that our metrics team is constantly kind of keeping abreast of how we can improve metrics at large to really inform some of these decisions that now take into consideration economic factors, geopolitical factors, to your point. I will say that one of our standard impact metrics is exposure to labor risk. Same thing with biodiversity impact, animal welfare, you name it. And so today, we do have some standard metrics to definitely overlay and start to inform some of those ESG trade-offs you may be experiencing with all of these decisions. But I think this is a great idea and something that we would love to explore further. Okay, next question is from Manuel. Hello. Do you have any successful in-setting stories from HowGood clients to share with us later? Yeah, I think this is something that we'll definitely take back to our research team. We can also share some more technical guidance on our approach to kind of managing this, especially within GHG protocol. And so we will note this and come back to you. And thank you so much for the request. Okay. I see another question. How did HowGood source the data for uncooked beef from 3 different regions? So this is a really great question. I see it seems like it already was probably answered as well from Ethan. Thank you, Ethan. So I'll just leave everyone to read that response. But basically in some, yeah, I think it's amazing how much high quality data sources there are produced in terms of life cycle assessment studies that actually drill down into specific regions. And so long as it actually meets our thresholds for data quality to use, which we're very strict and critical on, then we will leverage it and be able to map it back to the region. And that goes for not just beef, but essentially everything we're mapping at large. Okay. How do you think the future of greenhouse gas disclosure and specifically Scope 3 emissions? What will that look like? Do you think the role of granular data will increase? My opinion, personally, I see that this has been answered already by Ethan. Thank you. But yeah, my opinion is this will be kind of table stakes in order to actually move the needle in terms of actually reporting on and gleaning the insights for GHG reduction. And so I think we're excited to kind of be at the forefront in terms of leading a lot of companies and working with a lot of the front runners in this space who are excited to get to work and accelerate progress there. Okay, how does HowGood provide uncertainty values for each factor? This is a really great question. Yeah, Ethan also answered this as well, but we have a lot of exciting work in this space. And if you ever wanted to demo and learn about our methodology for how we actually make sure that that's classified to all of our users and really understood, especially for reporting standards, we're happy to do that. And then we also offer in that white paper the business case for granular emission factors. Even if you're not working with HowGood today, we actually provide you with an exercise to evaluate the quality of emission factors you're using. And so it's an exercise that you can take. It's really simple just to understand if you may be at risk or using emission factors that could be implicating things later down the line with regard to business impact. Does the database include data for ingredients used in pet food, or is it all human grade? Yep, we work with pet food manufacturers, just in case anyone didn't read that response. Thank you for that question. And then I see another question that came through from Catherine. How does HowGood account for ingredients that use traditional agricultural practices versus sustainably accredited agricultural practices? So yeah, we would love to set up a conversation. I think this warrants kind of a more technical conversation by nature, so probably not going to get to it today, but we definitely have an approach in terms of how we support this, how we reflect this, all while maintaining compliance with the GHG protocol and especially LSR guidance as well. Noting. Okay, I see one that has came through from Bailey. Does HowGood cite the data sources for each region? If there is new research available, how do you find out about it to update numbers? I love this question, and the answer is yes. So everywhere in HowGood's Lattice platform, you'll be able to actually click into the raw material, the metric, you can see the sourcing location, really whatever you're looking to kind of account for, scenario plan with, you'll be able to click into it, and within one click, you can see the data source that HowGood leveraged with regard to calculating that. And this isn't just for GHG emissions. This is also for statistical land use change. This is also for soil health. We look at soil organic carbon. And so we're making sure that everything is as transparent as possible in order to substantiate anything you want to do in the market, not just with the reporting, but also for sustainability level product claims as well. Okay, I think hopefully that answers everything. Obviously, we all have so much more to discuss at a later point in time, so please feel free to reach out to us. It has been an absolute pleasure to spend the hour with you. And welcome to the HowGood community if you have not been with us before, and welcome back to current customers, prospective customers, friends in the industry. And yeah, we'll go ahead and close. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.